This computer. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the friends of Lead Integrity members, partners, anyone happening to pass through our podcast on the integrity of leadership. We are still commemorating, so to speak, as it's the first week of February, World Interfaith Harmony Week. And we're delighted to be able to host this conversation with someone who is a professor to me, but never was actually a professor to me. It is through actions and writings and engagement that he is my professor, so to speak. And I speak specifically of Cole Durham Jr. Professor Cole Durham is the president of the G-20 Interfaith Forum Association and founding director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University. He graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School and was note editor of the Harvard Law Review and managing editor of the Harvard International Law Journal. Professor Cole has focused on comparative law scholarship with an emphasis on comparative constitutional law. He's the immediate past president of the International Consortium for Law and Religious Studies, ICLARS, being its acronym, Milan, Italy, and he's a co-editor-in-chief of the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion. He serves as the secretary of the American Society of Comparative Law, and he did that from 1989 to 1994. He was associate member of the International Academy of Comparative Law in Paris. In earlier years, he served as chair both of the Comparative Law section and the Law and Religion section of the American Association of Law Schools. Together with Brett Scharfs, he has authored Law and Religion, National, International, and Comparative Perspectives, which came out in 2019 as a second edition. And he's a co-editor with Gerard Robbers of the Encyclopedia of Law and Religion that came out in 2016 by Brill. He's a co-author of a 4-volume treatise entitled Religious Organizations and the Law. And that came out by Thomson Reuters West in 2023. Professor Cole Durham, it is a genuine privilege, an honor, and a joy to have you with us. Thank you so much and very welcome to our Integrity of Leadership podcast.
Well, thank you. You're one of my heroes. So,
well, that makes my entire remaining years of life. Thank you so much. I actually am really thrilled for a number of reasons. Having had the privilege of being able to see you in action in multiple places over several years, and given this particular moment where it would seem to me that law is the most threatened species of existence at the moment, given what's going on around us, I really am grateful that you take the time, and I know it's been it always is a very busy time for you. I'm grateful that you will give us some time to look at what's going on around us today in the interfaith space, because so far it hasn't been, lots has been said and done and is being said and done about the role of religion, the role of religions, the impact of religions, etc. Plenty of engagement, as we spoke before. But I think the question always is where and in what way does the interfaith, which is distinct from Catholic and Muslim and Hindu and Buddhist and whatever distinct engagements, but the interfaith world, where and how is that world performing, and how is it performing in the context, especially of a very tumultuous world that we're living in? And I think there were a number of questions that I had shared with you earlier, but I just wanted first, before we delve into the questions, just to hear how you came into this space of engaging with religions and especially the interfaith sites. Just your own journey, in as much as you would care to share, please.
Great. Well, thank you. It's a longer story than you might want to hear, but my academic career happened to coincide with the rebirth of law and religion in American law. I graduated the Law and Religion section of the American Association of Law Schools was created 2 years before I started teaching, and almost from the beginning, I became the secretary of that section of the American Association of Law Schools for about half of the 80s, and that led into other things. I was always heavily involved in comparative law, comparative constitutional law, and unlike most Americans, I had actually learned something about law and religion in other countries. I did my third year paper at Harvard on German church state theory. And so when the wall came down, well, I became the secretary of the American Society of Comparative Law
Mhm.
about 3 weeks before the law wall came down in Berlin. And within 3 months, it was clear that all kinds of things were going to be radically new in Eastern Europe. And I was, in some ways, catapulted to the forefront of that. But I of course came at things from a legal and comparative standpoint at first. But I got my own interest in the field. I had uh, taken everything possible at Harvard Law School on law and religion and church and state. It was about three courses. It was not major, but uh, but that was one of my long-term interests, and I've taught a course or a seminar on that every year for the past, well, until I retired a few years ago. So I came at this field not so much as an interfaith person per se. I came from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. My great-grandparents were in the original wagon train, uh, settled Utah with Brigham Young, and have handcart pioneers. So it's hard to be more than a fifth generation Mormon, but that's what I am. But I grew up with the background stories of religious persecution of my own tradition, so I was always interested in religious freedom. And then the way I got into this, well, the legal side almost always has a kind of interfaith dimension, but it's not like the classical interfaith that is, dialogue about differences in religion and how we can find common ground and things like that. It was always more action oriented. How do we find, because I was working in legal areas that uh, where there would be opportunities for religious groups to come together because they had these common problems. So I dealt with them as initially as religious liberty problems. But then in 2014, a friend of mine in Australia said, and by that time I had organized the Law and Religion Center at BYU, and we were partnering on all kinds of conferences. We were probably by then doing about 20 a year. And one of my friends from Australia called up and said, well, the G20 is going to be in Brisbane this year. Why don't you come and do a conference here? And so that I plunked into the G20 process with some naivete. But that began a process that started every year for the next, well, ever since. Uh, we've done G20 interfaith conferences in each year in each host country of the G20. Now, I have to tell you, every year has been different. I mean, the year in China was quite different than most other places you can imagine. But we've had sort of very positive experiences, and the G20 platform. I didn't realize at the time, but it's it's really on the one hand it's informal, but it represents something like 80 to 85% of world economic output. That is the G20 countries. Now it's the G20, which is 19 countries plus the EU. And more recently, in the past 2 or 3 years, it's been plus the African Union. So there are really about 90 plus countries that are affected, and other countries pay attention. So I got interested in this both legally, but also realizing that this is a place where multi-faith players can come together. And so there's an entire field of interfaith relations, which you know much better than I do. But for me, it has been, and I think in some ways it's what it, it's different than the old classic interfaith work, which was more doctrinal and ecclesiastical in nature. And it's more bringing high-level religious leaders together with government leaders, with academic leaders, with other NGOs, and forging, identifying common areas where people can work together. And so well, that's a longer story than you no doubt wanted, but
No, that's
it gives,
perfect because it actually addresses a number of the questions that I wanted
yeah.
to ask you. I think there's a couple of things that I would ask you to help nuance for the us for listeners. Um, you speak about interfaith and multi-faith sometimes interchangeably, and I'm wondering, in your readout of what's going on and in your own engagement, do you see interfaith and multi-faith pretty much as the same thing, or is there any distinction to be made?
Well, I've come to realize there is a distinction, and in some ways, if I were to, well, I hate to use the word christen things again, but the but if I were to start over, I might use the term multi-faith. I think the difference, as people understand it, is interfaith has classically been associated with ecumenism and trying to find commonalities so that people, by finding common denominators, could work together more comfortably that way. I think multi-faith is a term, I've learned it from people like David Saperstein and Bob Roberts and Imam Majid and their multi-faith network, neighborhood network. I don't have quite the right name, but and the point is, the emphasis on multi-faith is that you can join together with others without feeling any need to compromise your own doctrine or theological position, but you can recognize that you share concerns. Now, in many ways, for people who are not technical about this, the two things could go together. But there are many groups for whom the interfaith can become a code word for let's get together and see how we can compromise our doctrine. And that's clearly not what multi-faith is about, and certainly hasn't been uh, uh, the main thrust of what I'm doing. What I see happening through the G20 is that it's a unique platform. Obviously, a lot of people have just heard of it or don't even know about it, but religious leaders tend to understand the importance of this platform. It's not full, it's sort of informal. The G20 doesn't even have a secretariat. It has it has a rotating each year a different country is the head of the G20. This year it's the US, next year it's the UK. Last year was South Africa. There's enough difference between South Africa and the US that the US has disinvited South Africa next year. I'm not sure they have authority to do that, but Trump sometimes acts without authority. So, uh, but there's no secretariat. Each country chooses its own priorities. But my experience has been, certainly for the past decade, things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals have been consistently part of what the G20 is doing. A large part, of course, is economics, and the problems of debt are key to many of the other social problems that we have. But this provides a platform where people can come together, and the sophisticated religious leaders understand that if you're going to do anything through the G20 process, you have to come up with some common themes. And given virtually any set of country priorities for the year, they will line up in some way with things that religious communities have been concerned with forever. And so it's a tremendous place to uh, forge consensus, but not doctrinal consensus, but consensus on problems we can solve together.
So I notice when you speak that often, in fact, there's a very strong link between the G20 and the G20 interfaith uh,
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what is that link exactly? And is the G20 Interfaith Group part officially of the G20? If it's not, how do you align with it? Are there any issues about being together yet distinct? Because you
Yeah,
speak of them as though they are one and the same, and we know that they're not. So
right.
maybe just to help us
Let
understand
me give
that.
you
Yeah.
the history on that is several of our the G20 host countries. Well, let me back up one step. The G20 process includes a set of, you can call it almost like planets in orbit around the G20. So there are different engagement groups, and there are a set of, I don't even know how to count. It used to be 13, and they were counting something like 22 in South Africa. So I'm not sure exactly who South Africa was counting. But it's groups like the B20 for business, L20 for labor, U20 for urban affairs. There are about five of the areas that deal with, well, the SDGs that deal with environment. There's the W20 for women, the Y20 for youth, the T20 for think tanks. There's a parliamentary engagement group now. So we came into this process and initially tried to figure out how you become a formal engagement group. And we had several of the host countries that wanted to, that actually did treat us as an engagement group. And in fact, they thought we were a particularly effective engagement group. But after having, let's see, Italy and Saudi Arabia and Brazil sort of recommend us that we should get formal status, when it was India's year, the person who was in charge of the G20 process in India, he had been the ambassador to the United States, so we had some contacts and we met with him. He said, "Well, it's very nice that you want to be an engagement group, but engagement groups are chosen by consensus of the G20 countries, and you'll never get China to sign on to a religious engagement group." And we also had some others experience was because we had some divisions within our ranks as to whether it was better to be sort of an informal engagement group that could be an international and work with the G20 without being subject to the control of whoever was in charge that year. So at this point, we are an informal engagement group. We tend to have a strong credibility because we have a very good track record with many of the G20 countries. But that's the exact story of our status. That's why we are an informal group rather than a formal engagement group.
And to what extent does this informality actually support and or is not supported by, so in other words, how impactful can you be as an interfaith group? Impactful
Yeah,
meaning with these particular G20 actors.
yeah. So let me start by saying something about impact, because one's first thought is at the end of the G20 process each year, there is a final communique. We now know enough to know that it starts being negotiated. It's 6 months earlier. Uh, the turnover each year is December 1st. Trump this year is scheduling the final meeting for December 14th at one of his golf courses in Miami. And we think he doesn't know that it's supposed to happen before rather than after the turnover. But so so the, but what is the effect? Uh, so one effect would be to how many words do you get into the final communique? How many phrases, etc. So that's something we've been actually moderately effective in doing that. It's very hard because there's tremendous pressure on that final communique. But what we've learned in the meantime, and what I think is really actually more important, is that in the process leading up to that final leader meeting of the leaders of countries, there are a lot of pre-meetings, like ministerial meetings with ministers from various departments of government. There are a lot of other opportunities, and as one's working on crafting that final communique, there are opportunities for meetings with a lot of people who are one or two steps down in the governmental hierarchies of the G20 countries. And we've learned to be quite effective, particularly, we're getting better at this, but particularly in Brazil and South Africa, we had local organizing committees that had fantastic contacts with, I mean, would be with someone in the president's office who the foreign minister had to go through to get to the president. I mean, it's a little exaggerated, but we've been able to figure out who some of the people at the next level down are, and we've been good partners in the sense that we can help identify areas where religious communities are really going to back what they're trying to do and may bring experience and other things to bear that can be added into the process. So, from my perspective, the bigger impact than the communique is the opportunity to have a platform that brings religious leaders from very diverse perspectives to view on certain common themes that line up with the country's priorities for the year, but you can then talk to the actual people in the government of the countries, and you can also have religious leaders talking to each other about how do we work together on these projects. So it's like a lot of human rights. A lot of human rights is as you know from your work, is there's international human rights law, but if you really look at the sanctions and so forth, they're pretty weak. But human rights workers have been very creative at how to use those tools to have impact. And I think one of the things that's happening with us is we've learned how to use this platform in ways that can see where there are real targets that we can have influence on and work together with religious leaders. And frankly, I think the governments, our experience is it's helpful for them to work with us because while many of the religious communities will have their own channel of communication with the government, it's easier for them to deal with sort of a mediating body that can bring people together, help sort out their differences and find commonalities so that the government isn't trapped by what looks to them somewhat like a can of worms.
That makes a lot of sense. And it also begs a particular question that's been becoming more and more, I think, relevant to answer, which is, can you give a concrete example of a situation where any of the G20 countries in any of these gatherings have actually had an opportunity to benefit from the presence of the religious leaders in the country, um, to actually help them think through, or not, I dare not say to sort something out, but to think through something together? Are there any instances or examples of this that you may wish to point to, given you've been doing this since 2014? It's over, definitely over 10 years now. It's 12 years, right?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
let me try and give some examples. So it depends on the country and it depends on the religious leaders. In South Africa, uh, Archbishop Makoba, and I may be mispronouncing his name, but successor of Desmond Tutu as sort of leader of the Anglican Church in South Africa, someone who has tremendous influence in public. And so what he says is really listened to. Similarly, that in last year, South Africa uh, was the host country. And when we had our meeting, we had both uh, the Catholic bishop, who was sort of the head of Catholic bishops in the country, and Archbishop Magoba speaking, and the, the G20 platform gave them, I think, a very particularly effective platform to speak to people in power. And they're people that, I mean, they have those two, of course, have their own connections and could, but it's sometimes very helpful to be speaking from not just your own community's self-interest, but from the larger interests of the country.
Mm.
So that's
So
That's one kind of example.
would it be that this is therefore an opportunity for certain religious leaders from this multi-religious platform to be able to speak certain truths to the leadership of the particular country in which the G20 is being hosted, that this is that opportunity to voice, magnify that kind of wisdom?
Yes. And
Okay.
also, I mean, it depends on the country, but in places where there's a very cooperative relationship already between religion and state officials, uh, you can bring the wisdom and experience of religious groups to bear on policy formation. I mean, one of the interesting things, and this is part of reflection of the secularization of the world, uh, and and also sort of experience that religious diversity and uh, polarization can be a problem sometimes for government to deal with. And there are also, depending on the country, constitutional issues about how closely government officials can partner with religious groups and so forth. But what we've found is that uh, the G20 platform opens up possibilities for partnership that might not otherwise happen. So one reason things don't happen is there's just this kind of built-in, I'll call it the can of worms perception, that from the standpoint of the state, they just as soon not tinker with religion at all because it just can unleash problems. But the reality is that government leaders who understand how religious communities can help them and what they want to accomplish, this opens up possibilities of partnership, of working together, working in ways that are sensitive to the fact that the government power shouldn't be used to come in on one side or another of religious debates, but ways that you can partner on things where there really is common interest, like the hunger problem. That's an issue which every government in the world has to be concerned about that. Every religious community is concerned with it, and religious communities have a tremendous amount of experience about how to do things that will optimize help that is given. So I think it opens up possible channels for partnership, both between the religious groups themselves and between religion and government officials, public sector officials. And that can be extremely fruitful.
I think it's very helpful to hear because very often in the space of the so-called interfaith, there's a lot of questions about what impact, and then indeed that's why we're focusing in this particular set of podcast episodes on the value added of the interfaith space. Now, what I've heard you say, Professor Durham, is to underline the fact that religious leaders um, have a role to play, and that the G20 Interfaith Forum is an opportunity for them to not only come together, but also to address specific issues of common concern with experience in having sorted them out, or working with them or on them or about them.
Right.
What I'm still missing, I think, is your take on what is it that religious leaders have actually done together, whether in terms of public advocacy or address within the space of G20 Interfaith Forum, whether it's in terms of advocacy, the speaking, but and or in terms of actual initiatives, programs that addressed common ills in society. Have there been any, is there one particular example that comes to mind that you'd want to share, either on the public advocacy thing? And remember, it's them together. It's not one of them addressing his or her
Yeah.
government, but what have they been able to do together thanks to the G20 Interfaith Forum that has positioned them as public advocates, effective public advocates on something, and or what have they been able to do together in practice, projects, initiatives that have actually addressed an issue that is common concern?
Yeah. So let me take the example of trafficking and modern forms of slavery. This is something that everyone is concerned with. Uh, one of the things that happened at the social summit last year is we had Kevin Highland, who's had years of experience both as a police officer originally and then leading anti-trafficking initiatives in the UK, and then working globally with the Vatican and so forth. And one of the things that uh, was announced at our event in the G20 Social Summit this year is it's launched the Modern Slavery Prevention Index, which launched by Kevin at our meeting at the G20 Social Summit in South Africa, and it represents a groundbreaking platform that tracks and analyzes how G20 and other governments are working to prevent exploitation of modern slavery. Now, our experience has been uh, that this has it's brought Catholic sisters who have some of the most effective programs together with other religious groups that are concerned about. It's helped to uh, generate deeper understanding of the scope of the problem. I mean, Kevin's perception is if people realize the scope of the problem and how minuscule the real government funding against this is, there's a tremendous room for additional coming together. But I mean, it's hard. It's a little hard to say because some of these groups have figured out that they should work with other groups already. I mean, it's not like we're creating something new, but through our network of networks, it helps bring people together.
Mhm.
And then we're seeing more and more practical ways. Kevin's work, for example, looks not only at what the costs are, what the unfortunately low levels of prosecution are, uh, but he's been able to work with, on the one hand, Pam Bondi, who is very concerned about trafficking, but you know, a whole range of people in the Vatican and other religious groups. So this is a concrete area that has some visibility, not enough visibility, and we've been able to help bring more and bring people together who are working on it.
Mm, great.
So that so that's an example. Food, food crisis would be another example. And there we've done everything by having sort of a food packaging process as part of one of our as our South African enterprise. That's more symbolic, I suppose. But I think there are ways in the food area now. A lot of work on food, uh, solving food shortages, is done by major humanitarian aid organizations, many of which are religiously affiliated. One of the things we've done with the G20 conference is typically we've had some people from some of the major religiously affiliated humanitarian aid organizations come together, and in many cases that leads to joint efforts, sharing of funding of really big projects, et cetera.
Mhm.
So
Okay,
I
so
think it's an ongoing challenge, but there are areas like that that we can really have an impact on.
that's good to know. That's very, very good to know. And thank you for sharing those. I think we now come towards, if you will, the latter part, and also the more maybe perhaps more complicated part, because as you know, there is a relationship between the religious and the political. And you mentioned having one of your meetings in Saudi Arabia. That is not exactly a part of the world that is averse to working with religion. Between the religious and the political, there's a very strong relationship there. So it's not
Yeah,
a universally secular context. In fact, I would differ from your read of the world to say
yeah,
that
no,
secularization.
it's mixed. Yeah, it's
Um,
very mixed. Yeah,
yeah, no, but I think just so looking at that, looking at some of those religious, political, and then of course the United States isn't immune from some of those marriages either. Um, I'm wondering, how do you see the role of the G20 interfaith in tackling some of those some of those relationships between the religious and the political elements? As is this something that has come across your discussions, debates, etc.? And what happens when invariably, in many of these cases, where certain religious and certain political are working together, the outcome is not necessarily always a pro-human rights space or reality. And so where does the G20 Interfaith Forum sit on these issues? How have you tackled them, if at all, especially that we're still living in the context of genocides that take place that are often religiously vindicated or validated by political regimes and vice versa. So where does the G20 Interfaith Forum stand and sit in this space? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're right. It's very complicated, and you know how complicated it is even more acutely than I do, given your past experience. But let me maybe start with the Saudi Arabian year. Now, Saudi Arabian year happened to be the COVID year. So the original plan in Saudi Arabia was to have the largest interfaith, multi-faith gathering that had ever been held in world history in Saudi Arabia. Uh, and and Saudi Arabia had the money to do it. And then we got struck by COVID, and so everything we couldn't do you couldn't fly people anywhere. I mean, well, it's very tough. So we had to do that year uh, in a hybrid fashion, and we had about 2,000 people involved in one way or another that year during the meetings. Saudi Arabia was one of the countries that would really have liked to have us be a formal engagement group, but yeah, it didn't quite happen. Uh, but but
Saudi Arabia was in favor of G20 Interfaith becoming a formal engagement group of the G20.
yeah, yeah, but there are pluses and minuses to that because I'm sure they would have liked to appoint all our governing board as well. You can I mean I think they were sophisticated in terms of how to deal with us and so on. So there are problems depending on the way that a government structure is connected with or not with religion, and there are a range of possibilities. I've written extensively on the full range of everything from uh, uh, theocracy to sort of Albanian anti-religious, you know. So there's just a whole range, and the human rights area is someplace in the middle. But even there, you've got differences between European countries and the U.S. and well, and France with its laïcité. So so that's always one part of the background. Another part is different theological traditions about how groups deal with the state. Uh, and in some ways, we come in and just say, well, let's try and work with. So each of these governments, I mean, you can imagine that the list of priorities for Saudi Arabia was slightly different than uh, Italy, slightly different than Germany, definitely different than China, definitely different. So each year, one thing that happens typically at the time of the turnover in December is that you see the countries, what their priorities for the year are going to be, and some of them will be economic, but some will be lined up with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we can typically identify things that will allow us to work collaboratively with the government in question without giving up our own identity, and that we can find ways that the broad range of religious communities can find an effective voice. Now, one of the challenges is this is not just, you know, hunkering down and doing whatever the local government wants to be. That's one of the reasons it's actually helpful not to be an engagement group, because we have some independence in what we do. We also have creativity. Now, the U.S. year and the U.S. objectives uh, look look different. I mean, it's deregulation for economic growth, energy security, which means dig a lot of oil wells as best we can tell, and uh, uh, and then technological advance. Now, what we're able to do, for example, technological advance, one of the huge issues these days is artificial intelligence, AI. And this is something that major religious communities have made statements on, through the Vatican, for example, but others as well. Uh, and there's a real role and a legitimate concern that religious communities have about how AI is going to be used and abused. And we can bring that voice to bear under the uh, objective three. But we can have very authentic religious voices, which will have meaningful things to say about what things are going to be necessary uh, in that area. Uh, Take the idea of deregulation. I mean, it's clear that the Trump administration has one idea. My first thought when I saw that one was, aha, you know what the real deregulation is, and that's religious freedom. But it's more complicated than that. But the point is, there will there will be whatever one says about economic growth. There's this huge debt issue that is one of the huge things hanging over, as cloud hanging over the South, and
Mhm.
actually hanging over all of us. And we have some some of the global leaders working on those kinds of problems. So I think the point is that and I think this is answering the question, but this is a way that religious communities can have a voice and find a way to make a helpful contribution virtually wherever the particular country is on politics and other kinds of polarization in general.
Mm. When you hear about the very legitimate concerns about the retraction of democracy and democratic norms, when you hear about the concerns that certain human rights get prioritized over others at the expense of others, perhaps sometimes, when you hear the repeated iterations of history shows that religions can and religious institutions and certain religious leaders actually can do harm more than they may be able to do good, which is a very old mantra, but you hear it also being reiterated. And when you hear about the instrumentalization by the religious of the political and by the political of the religious, and you have this world that is skewed towards young people, a large demography of younger people, what would coming into the labor market with a lot of concerns about rights, especially given the authoritarianism and the authoritarian tendencies of many regimes. In the old days, it used to be certain regimes. Today, I think we're looking at authoritarianism in almost every continent, including this one in the United States. What would you say to encourage younger people to see their role in contributing a value added, whatever it is, of working together multi-religiously? What would you want to say to encourage them that this is a worthy space to be engaged in, to work together multi-religiously, to work with religious leaders, institutions, in spite of it all? What would you say to encourage them, given your incredible history, accomplishments, knowledge, wisdom, and what you're seeing happen through this platform of the G20 Interfaith? What would you say to the young people of today to make multi-religious work worthwhile and important?
Well, it is a complicated issue, particularly since it's a little unclear. We're seeing the so-called rise of the nuns, the no religious affiliation. We're starting to see sociological studies that show the rise of the nuns does not necessarily mean rise of non-religiosity. It is partially that, but but uh, there is a considerable part of that that is simply disenchantment with organized religion as it's classically been around, and yet people will really resonate with some religious causes. So, for example, I mean, the example in Germany of people who would come to the aid of refugees, uh, even though and the likelihood they went to a church more than twice a year, Christmas and Easter, was probably low, and maybe not even those. So one does have sort of a different youth population that one's got to take into account. But uh, the reality is a high percentage of young people are religiously engaged, and as time goes on, they tend to settle in and become re-religious. Um, I guess I have a number of responses. One, it's incredibly important to find ways to involve young people in these kind of processes. And I have to tell you, it's very hard. And it's hard for the following reason. It costs as much money to fly a, a senior government official or a senior academic to a convention as to fly a young person. So the costs and the prioritization becomes difficult when everyone is facing limited funds. But it's critical that we find ways to involve young people, and that's going to happen more at the ground level than at the international level, although we try to find ways to make that happen as well. We work with uh, well, the Y-20, for example, which is expressly focused on youth. I've been in conversation with the head of the Y-20 this year. Uh, we have the ACWAY, which is a common word among youth, which is one large uh, youth organization. But we need to find ways to work with those. After all, there's this tremendous youth bulge happening in Africa, and uh, and that's going to be a place for generating extremism, fundamentalism, poverty, unemployment, etc. And so we've got to find really effective ways to involve people. One of the other things I say, and this is just sort of a counsel of, I know I have maybe 10% of the people at our law school come to our law school so they can work on religious freedom issues, and then they realize there are not a lot of law firms that practice religious liberty work. Uh, and 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 I think part of it is that people need to understand to find ways to support themselves, but also to not forget their passion, which is often a passion on these issues, whether it be one of the things about the G20, I spent most of my life working on religious liberty. The G20 is broader and it can attract people to a broader range of projects that people can work on. But I think it's really important that, particularly at the ground level, at the local level of local congregations and so forth, people find ways to work together. And it's actually fairly easy to get young people pick a locality, have some young people from different denominations get together, spend a lunch trying to figure out something they can work on together, and they can do it, and they can do something productive right away. And I think we need to find and encourage those kinds of activities. There are a lot of, yeah, so that's one approach. I think it's one of the mega issues. But the other thing I would say is I continue to think that we think about the human rights issues, we think about religions working together. Uh, I believe that religious liberty is the master key of modernity, that Locke and his uh, fellow thinkers, well, what's been three centuries, 4 centuries ago,
Mhm.
they figured out that what's really going on that causes a lot of polarization is fear. And if you can have genuine religious liberty that will make people assured that they will be okay in their own beliefs, that will free up tremendous amounts of social energy that can be, instead of mobilized to protect oneself against the state, can be used in productive ways. And I think we've got to have that happen.
You have just opened a theme for discussion, which would take us easily at least another hour to discuss, but absolutely not possible given the
Yeah.
limitations of your precious time. But I just want to say deep thanks for that particular series of insights and wisdoms. I do believe that um, there are pros and cons to pushing religious liberty as the foundational need within a human rights space and agenda, because there are at least 18
Well,
other
it can be,
articles that are completely interdependent on one another, trying to prioritize one and seeing one as the most foundational. Many groups will see each of those articles as the most foundational to the others. And I do think that we're living in the midst of that tension right now. Which human rights matter
yeah,
more? And the issue is all human rights matter all the time, always, and they matter
yeah.
together. And you can't really get one without the others. But
Well,
that
that's right.
is, those are different perspectives. And I think it's very helpful that you also noted how this larger cohort of young people can also be seen as a potentiality for more violence, more extremism, but at the same time it's also frankly our only hope for a better world, because
Yeah,
you and
absolutely.
I only have so much to stay and to contribute. When I see our students, and I know that you have the same situation, there is that kindling of hope in a tomorrow that is different from what we've done so far. And so the young people as a potential for the better, but for the better understanding and learning from the lessons of today. And the lessons of today include what you have so very brilliantly outlined, which is how do we work on many fronts at the same time and not see one front as more important than the other? Because by doing so over many decades, I think we've lost out ultimately on our interdependence as human beings on a planet, on one another's welfare, and so on. So I think it's extremely helpful to listen and see how you have built very strong foundations and infrastructure like the G20 interfaith, which is only one of the many things you've built and you are building. It's very important to hear about how that has come together and how it is contributing. And I do want to say congratulations, Professor Durham. And obviously, if we were to give a prize for a lifetime achievement in lead integrity, which we're building towards, your name would be right up there in terms of the people who deserve it so much, so very, very much. So I just want to say hats off, Professor
Thank you.
Colder, for all your work, for all your commitment, and certainly for building, for continuing to build with so much wisdom, and for keeping law as our ultimate goal, but also the very basis on which we all stand and serve. Thank you, Professor Calder, for your time
Thank you.
and wisdom.
Great. Thank you very much. It's been a privilege to talk with you as always.
I'm going to